Hello friends, in this video we are going to discuss about the second part of the constitutional developments in India, that is the Crown Rule 1858 to 1947. We had already discussed about the Company Rule. If you don't watch that video, the link is in the description box. Please have a look into it before watching this video. Now about the course outline. Lesson 1 Introduction, Lesson 2 Chronology, Lesson 3 Government of India Act of 1858, Lesson 3 Indian Councils Act of 1861, Lesson 4 Empress of India Act of 1876, Lesson 5 Resolution of 1882, Lesson 6 Indian Councils Act of 1892, Lesson 7 Indian Councils Act of 1909, Lesson 8 Montagu Declaration, Lesson 9 Government of India Act of 1919, Lesson 10 Simon Commission, Lesson 11 Communal Award, Lesson 12 Government of India Act of 1935, Lesson 13 Adoption of the Pakistan Resolution, Lesson 14 Indian Independence Act of 1947, Lesson 15 Conclusion, and Lesson 16 Readings and Recommendations. Introduction. The revolt of 1857 is always known as the first war of Indian independence. The revolt of 1857 is also known as Sepoy Mutiny. The revolt is not just a revolt, but a reflection of the discontent, hatred, and accumulated grievances of the Indian people against the foreign rule. This revolt clearly indicated a need for change in the existing administration. Therefore, the British government decided to abolish the East India Company in India. This abolition of the East India Company by the British government marks the beginning of the company rule in India. Before having a look into the acts, let's discuss the chronology. It is very important in any competitive exam point of view. In the previous UGC net examination, there are much the following questions were from the national movements also in addition to the constitutional developments. Therefore, the chronology. 1858 Beginning of Crown Rule. 1861 Indian Councils Act. 1872 First All India Census. 1875 Formation of Arya Samaj. 1876 Empress of India Act. 1882 Resolution of 1882. 1885 Formation of International Congress. 1891 Age of Consent Act. 1892 Indian Councils Act. 1893 Swami Vivekananda participated in the World Parliament of Religions. 1899 Curzon arrives as Viceroy. 1905 Bengal Partition, Swadeshi movement begins, Gokhale founds Servants of Society. 1906 Formation of Muslim League. 1907 Tata Iron and Steel Company founded. 1909 Indian Councils Act. Gandhi publishes Hindu Swaraj. 1911 Delhi made capital. 1914 First World War. 1916 Congress and League joined in Lucknow Pact. 1917 Montagu Declaration of Eventual Responsible Government. 1919 Government of India Act. Rowlatt's Act, Amritsar Massacre, Montagu Chelmsford report offers Dayaki. 1920 Gandhi launched India's self-rule. 1922 Chauri Chaura killing, Gandhi calls of non-cooperation. 1925 RSS founded. 1927 Appointment of Simon Commission. 1930 Civil Disobedience Movement, London Round Table Conference. 1932 Communal Award, Pune Pact between Gandhi and Ambedkar. 1935 Government of India Act. 1937 Elections under 1935 Act give Congress control of 7 provinces. 1939 Second World War. 1940 Adoption of Pakistan Resolution. 1942 Cripps Mission, Quit India Movement. 1943 Bengal Famine. 1947 Indian Independence. 1948 Mahatma Gandhi assassination. 1950 Constitution was adopted and India becomes Republic. This is also important in the perspective of Indian politics. Now let's have a detailed look into the acts. The first one is the Government of India Act of 1858. The Government of India Act was enacted in the wake of the revolt of 1857. This Government of India Act of 1858 is also known as the Act for the Good Government of India. This act marks the abolition of East India Company. This act, by abolishing the East India Company, transferred the powers of the government, territories and revenues to the British Crown. This marked the beginning of Crown rule in India. Then about the features of this act. The features of this act are, it provided that India was to be governed by and in the name of Her Majesty, that is the Queen of Britain. It changed the designation of the Governor General of India to that of the Viceroy of India. Earlier, there was a post named as the Governor General of India. Now that is changed into Viceroy of India. This Viceroy was a direct representative of the British Crown in India. The first such Viceroy of India is Lord Canning. Remember, the first Viceroy of India is Lord Canning. Then this Government of India Act of 1858 ended the system of double government in India. This ended the double government by abolishing the Board of Control and Court of Directors. This act also created a new office called the Secretary of State for India. This office of the Secretary of State for India vested with complete authority and control over Indian administration. This Secretary of State was a member of the British government and he was solely responsible to the British Parliament. This act also established a 15-member Council of India to assist the Secretary of State for India. This council is only an advisory body. The Secretary of State of India was a chairman of this advisory council. This act constituted the Secretary of State and Council as a body corporate capable of suing and being sued in India and in England. The Act of 1858 is only an act for the improvement of the administrative machinery by which the Indian government was to be supervised and controlled in England. This act only improved how the way England is controlling the way of administration in India. It does not alter any substantial way the system of government that prevailed in India. It does not lead to any efficiency in the governmental system that prevailed in India. Indian Councils Act of 1861. By realizing that there is much discontent among the Indians through the Great Revolt of 1857, the British government felt the necessity of seeking the cooperation of the Indians in the administration of their country. So, the pursuance of the policy of this association, 3 acts were enacted by the British Parliament, respectively in 1861, 1892 and 1909. The first act enacted is the Indian Councils Act of 1861. It is an important landmark in the constitutional and political history of India. The major features of this act are: the major feature is this act marked the beginning of the representative institutions in India by associating Indians with the lawmaking process. It provided that the Viceroy should nominate some Indians as a non-official members of his expanded council. For that purpose, in 1862, Lord Canning, the then Viceroy of India, nominated 3 Indians to his legislative council: the Raja of Benares, the Maharaja of Patiala and Sri Dinagar Rao. This act also initiated the process of decentralization by restoring the legislative powers to the Bombay and Madras presidencies. This, by making decentralization, has reversed the centralizing tendency that started from the Regulating Act of 1773 and reached its climax under the Charter Act of 1833. This act also provided for the establishment of new legislative councils for Bengal, northwestern provinces and Punjab, which were established in 1862, 1886 and 1897 respectively. The new legislative council for Bengal was established in 1862, northwestern provinces in 1886 and Punjab in 1897. This act also empowered the Viceroy to make rules and orders for the more convenient transaction of business in the council. This act gave a recognition to the portfolio system. This portfolio system was introduced by Lord Canning in 1859. This portfolio system means that a member of the Viceroy's Council was made in charge of one or more departments of the government and was authorized to issue final orders on behalf of the Council on matters of his department. Therefore, this Act gave an official recognition to the portfolio system introduced by Lord Canning in 1859. This Act also empowered the Viceroy to issue ordinances without the concurrence of the Legislative Council during an emergency. These ordinances initiated by the Viceroy has a life of only 6 months. Empress of India Act of 1876. The Empress of India Act of 1876 is also known as the Royal Titles Act. This act also was enacted in the United Kingdom Parliament. This act officially recognized Queen Victoria as the Empress of India, thus by officially transferring the power to the Crown. Resolution of 1882. The Resolution of 1882 marked the beginning of the eventual self-government in India. Lord Ripon is known to have granted the Indians' first taste of freedom by introducing the local self-government in 1882. His scheme of local self-government developed the municipal institutions which had been growing up in the country ever since India was occupied by the British Crown. He led a series of enactments in which larger powers of the local self-government were given to the rural and urban bodies and the elective people received some wider rights. Lord Ripon is known as the father of local self-government in India. This was not enacted by any act. Therefore, it remains only as a resolution that was passed in 1882. Indian Councils Act of 1892. The features of this act were: the Indian Councils Act of 1892 increased the number of additional or non-official members. These non-official members are the Indian members nominated by the Viceroy. These Indian members in the central and provisional legislative councils. Although this has increased the number of additional members in the central and provisional legislative councils, but the official majority was still maintained with the British. The second one is that it also increased the functions of the legislative councils and gave them the power of discussing the budget and addressing questions to the executive. It increases the functions of the legislative councils. This act also provided for the nomination of some non-official members of the Central Legislative Council. The nomination of Central Legislative Council is made by the Viceroy on the recommendation of the Provisional Legislative Councils and the Bengal Chamber of Commerce. Also, it provided for the nomination of some non-official members of the Provisional Legislative Councils by the governors on the recommendation of the district boards, municipalities, universities, trade associations, zamindars and chambers. This act made use of the word nomination instead of election. Indian Councils Act of 1909. Indian Councils Act of 1909 is also known as the Morley-Minto Reforms. This act was known by this name because Lord Morley was the then Secretary of the State for India and Lord Minto was the then Viceroy of India. The features of this act is that although the functions of the Legislative Council is increased by the previous act, this act considerably increased the size of the legislative councils, size of both central and provisional legislative councils. The number of members in the Central Legislative Council was raised from 16 to 60. The number of members in the Provisional Legislative Councils was not at all uniform, but it retained the official majority in the Central Legislative Council but allowed the Provisional Legislative Councils to have a non-official majority. That is, the majority in the Central Legislative Council is still the Britishers, but the majority in the Provisional Legislative Councils can be Indians. This act also enlarged the deliberative functions of the legislative councils at both the levels. Deliberative functions means that the powers of the members were allowed to ask supplementary questions, move resolutions on the budget, and so on. This act also provided for the first time the association of Indians with the executive councils of the Viceroy and governors. Therefore, Satyendra Prasad Sinha became the first Indian to join the Viceroy's Executive Council. Satyendra Prasad Sinha was appointed as the law member. This act also introduced a system of communal representation for Muslims by accepting the concept of separate electorate. Under this system of communal representation, the Muslim members were to be elected only by Muslim voters. Thus, this act legalized communalism, and Lord Minto came to be known as the father of communal electorate. This act introduced a system of communal representation, and Lord Minto was known as the father of communal electorate. This act also provided for the separate representation of presidency corporations, chambers of commerce, universities, and seminars. Montagu Declaration. This declaration was made in August 1917. This declaration was made as a response to the Home Rule movement. As per the declaration, India is an integral part of British Empire, and a responsible government shall be established by the gradual development of self-governing institutions. Government of India Act of 1919. As a response to the Montagu Declaration, the British government enacted the Government of India Act of 1919. This act came into force in 1921. This act is also known as the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms because Montagu was a Secretary of the State for India and Lord Chelmsford was a Viceroy of India. The major features of this act are: it relaxed the central control over the provinces by demarcating and separating the central and provisional subjects. It marked for the first time the distinction between central and provisional subjects. The central and provisional legislatures were authorized to make laws on the respective list of subjects. However, this made demarcations, the structure of the government continued to be centralized and unitary. This act also further divided the provisional subjects into two parts, that is, the transferred and reserved subjects. The transferred subjects were to be administered by the governor with the aid of ministers responsible to the Legislative Council. But the reserved subjects were to be administered by the governor and his Executive Council without being responsible to the Legislative Council. In the case of reserved subjects, the governor is not responsible to the Legislative Council. This dual scheme of governance was known as diarchy. Diarchy is a Greek word which derived from the diarchy, which means double rule. However, this experiment was largely unsuccessful. This act also introduced for the first time bicameralism and direct elections in the country. Thus, the Indian Legislative Council was replaced by a bicameral legislature consisting of an upper house. This upper house is known as Council of State, and a lower house, and this lower house is known as Legislative Assembly. The majority of members of both the houses were chosen by direct election. This act also required that the 3 of the 6 members of the Viceroy's Executive Council, these 3 of the 6 members were other than the Commander-in-Chief, were to be Indian. This act also extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorate for 6 Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians and Europeans. Earlier, the communal representation was only for the Muslims. This act also extended the franchise to a limited number of people on the basis of property, tax or education. This act also created a new office of the High Commissioner for India in London and transferred to him some of the functions hitherto performed by the Secretary of State for India. Some of the functions performed by the Secretary of State for India were transferred into a new office called the High Commissioner for India in London. This act also provided for the establishment of a Public Service Commission. Hence, a Central Public Service Commission was set up in 1926 for recruiting the civil servants. This act also separated for the first time provisional budgets from the central budget. Earlier, these were all together and authorized the provisional legislatures to enact their own budgets. This act also provided for the appointment of a statutory commission to inquire into and report on his working after 10 years of his coming into force. Simon Commission. In November 1927, the British government announced the appointment of a 7-member statutory commission under the chairmanship of Sir John Simon to report on the condition of India under his new constitution. But the problem is that all the members of the commission were British. For this reason, all the parties boycotted the commission. The commission submitted its report in 1930 and made some recommendations. The major recommendations are abolition of diarchy, extension of responsible government in the provinces, establishment of a federation of British India and princely states, continuation of communal electorate. To consider the proposals of this commission, the British government convened 3 round-table conferences of the representatives of British government, British India and Indian princely states. On the basis of these 3 round-table conferences, a white paper on constitutional reforms was prepared and submitted for the consideration of the Joint Select Committee of the British Parliament. The recommendations of this committee were incorporated with certain changes in the next Government of India Act of 1935. Communal Award. In August 1932, Ramsay MacDonald, the British Prime Minister, announced a scheme of representation of the minorities. This scheme is known as Communal Award. The award not only continued separate electorate for the Muslims, Sikhs, Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians and Europeans, but also extended it to the depressed class, that is the scheduled caste. But Mahatma Gandhi was distressed over this extension of the principle of communal representation to the depressed class. Therefore, Mahatma Gandhi undertook fast unto death in Erwada jail in Pune to get the award modified. At last, there was an agreement between the leaders of the Congress and the depressed classes. This agreement is known as the Pune Pact. This agreement retained the Hindu joint electorate and gave reserved seats for the depressed class. Government of India Act of 1935. This act marked a second milestone towards a completely responsible government in India. This act was a lengthy and detailed document having 321 sections and 10 schedules. The major features of this act are: this act for the first time provided for the establishment of an all India federation consisting of provinces and princely states as units. This act divided the powers between the centre and units in terms of 3 lists. That is a federal list for centre with 59 items, provisional list for provinces with 54 items and the concurrent list for both with 36 items. This marked the beginning of the separation of the list between the central and state. Residuary powers were given to the viceroy. However, the federation never came into being as the princely states did not join in it. This act abolished the diarchy in the provinces and introduced provisional autonomy in its place. On the basis of this provisional autonomy, the provinces were allowed to act as autonomous units of administration in their defined spheres. Moreover, the act introduced responsible governments in provinces. That is, the governor was required to act with the advice of ministers responsible to the provisional legislature. This came into effect in 1937 and was discontinued in 1939. This act also provided for the adoption of diarchy at the centre. Consequently, the federal subjects were also divided into reserved subjects and transferred subjects. However, this provision of the Act did not come into operation at all. This Act introduced bicameralism in 6 out of 11 provinces. The provinces where bicameralism were introduced are Bengal, Bombay, Madras, Bihar, Assam and the United Provinces. In these provinces, there is a bicameral legislature consisting of a legislative council, upper house, and a legislative assembly, lower house. However, many restrictions were placed on them. This Act further extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates for depressed class, women and workers. It also abolished the Council of India, established by the Government of India Act of 1858. The Secretary of State for India was provided with a team of advisors. This Act also extended the franchise. From this Act onwards, about 10% of the total population got the voting right. This Act provided for the establishment of a Reserve Bank of India to control the currency and credit of the country. This Act also provided for the establishment of not only a Federal Public Service Commission but also a Provisional Public Service Commission and Joint Public Service Commission for 2 or more provinces. This Act also provided for the establishment of a federal court, which was set up in 1937. Major features of our constitution still exist are derived from the Government of India Act of 1935. Indian Independence Act of 1947. On February 20, 1947, the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee declared that the British rule in India would end by June 30, 1948. After which the power would be transferred to responsible Indian hands. This announcement of Clement Attlee was followed by the agitation by the Muslim League because they want the partition of the country. Again on June 3, 1947, the British government made it clear that any constitution framed by the Constituent Assembly of India cannot apply to those parts of the country which were unwilling to accept it. On the same day, that is on June 3, 1947, Lord Mountbatten, the Viceroy of India, put forth the partition plan. This plan is known as the Mountbatten Plan. This plan was accepted by the Congress and the Muslim League. Immediate effect of the Mountbatten Plan was given by enacting the Indian Independence Act of 1947. The features of this act are: it ended the British rule in India and declared India as an independent and sovereign state from August 15, 1947. This act also provided for the partition of India and the creation of 2 independent dominions of India and Pakistan, with the right to secede from the British Commonwealth. It also abolished the office of the Viceroy and provided for each dominion a position called Governor General. This Governor General was to be appointed by the British King on the advice of the dominant cabinet. His Majesty's government in Britain or the British Parliament was to have no responsibility with respect to the government of India or Pakistan. This act also empowered the constituent assemblies of the 2 dominions to frame and adopt any constitution for their respective nations and to repeal any act of the British Parliament, including the Indian Independence Act itself. It also empowered the constituent assemblies of both the dominions to legislate for their respective territories till the new constitutions were adopted and enforced. Therefore, the constituent assemblies of the dominions become the provincial legislature. No act of the British Parliament passed after August 15, 1947 was to extend to either of the 2 new dominions unless it was extended by a law of the legislature of the dominant. This act also abolished the office of the Secretary of State for India and transferred the functions of the Secretary of State for India to Secretary of State for Commonwealth Affairs. This act also proclaimed the lapse of British paramountcy over the Indian princely states and treaty relations with tribal areas from August 15 and 1947. This act granted freedom to the Indian princely states. They were given freedom to either to join the Dominion of India or Dominion of Pakistan or to remain independent. This act provided for the governance of each of the dominions and the provinces by the Government of India Act of 1935 till the new constitutions were framed. Until the new constitutions were framed, the new dominions were to be governed by the Government of India Act of 1935. The dominions were, however, authorized to make modifications in the act. This act also deprived the British monarch of his right to veto bills or ask for reservation of certain bills for his approval. This right was reserved then for the Governor General. The Governor General would have full power to assent to any bill in the name of His Majesty. This act designated the Governor General of India and the provisional governors as constitutional heads of the state, like the nominal heads of the states. They were made to act on the advice of the respective Council of Ministers in all the matters. This act dropped the title of Emperor of India from the royal titles of the King of England. This act discontinued the appointment to civil services and reservation of post by the Secretary of State for India. The members of the civil services appointed before August 15, 1947 would continue to enjoy all the benefits that they were entitled to till that time. At the stroke of the midnight of 15 August 1947, the British rule came to an end and power was transferred to the two new independent dominions of India and Pakistan. Lord Mountbatten became the first Governor General of the new Dominion of India. He saw in Jawaharlal Nehru as the first Prime Minister of independent India. The Constituent Assembly of India, formed in 1946, became the Parliament of the Indian Dominion. Conclusion. The major features of the Indian Constitution were borrowed from the Government of India Act of 1935 and subsequent acts. The features which are borrowed from the Government of India Act of 1935 are Federal Scheme, Office of Governor, Judiciary, Public Service Commissions, Emergency Provisions and Administrative Details. Now we are coming to the end of this video. Then about the reading and references. The recommended references are A Concise History of Modern India by Barbara T. Metcalfe and Thomas R. Metcalfe. Working of a Democratic Constitution, A History of Indian Experience by Granville Austin. Then the basic references are Indian Polity, M. Lakshmikant. A Brief History of Modern India, Spectrum. If you are new to this channel, please do like, share and subscribe. Stay connected with us. Stay safe, study safe. Thank you.